Pokémon is an enormous franchise that has continued to break the mold of what it can accomplish as the years progress, and stands the test of time as what could be the most recognizable series in the entire world. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when considering the amount of beta content and unreleased ideas that Nintendo and Game Freak have kept locked in the closet, never to see the light of day for better or worse. We as a fandom have recently been granted a taste of how monumental this quantity is, as the company has recently gone through what the fans have referred to as a Gigaleak, revealing to us roughly 1 terabyte of what could have been, ranging from early Pokemon designs and sprites to outright early game builds. But this Gigaleak holds a darker side to Game Freak that has had fans in a chokehold, a compilation of scrapped mythology with rather devious intentions. While it is surely jarring to see such documents from the official employees themselves, one of my main takeaways from this whole predicament is how the fans are handling such information, which is what I want to talk about today in an attempt to resolve for those either uninformed or simply still in disbelief. I'm Mew-TubeHK, and here's why the PokeHuman myths are not canon. To get straight to the point, we need to consider the most important factor in these stories. They are referred to as myths. This genre of storytelling has been used across the span of generations as a means for writers to reflect upon the values of their culture, teach a lesson to their readers, and so on. Not one is often written without reason, and from what I have read through these stories, they almost come off more as bad fan fiction than myth, as there ultimately aren't any meaningful conclusions to these tales aside from what people are currently referring to as the PokeHuman hybrids, the offspring of these Pokemon and humans loving each other very much. One could argue these stories parallel Sinnoh folk story number 3, which is present within the Canon library, telling of how the bond between humans and Pokemon was once so tight that there was little reason to distinguish the two from each other. This might be interpretation, but to me, such a folktale seems to be intended to inform readers of the friendship between these beings and the commitment to be a part of each other's lives, going so far as even to mention that they would marry in the game's Japanese translation. Given the circumstances that each human and Pokemon find themselves in these leaked stories, take the Ursaring and Slacking text for example, these relationships are far from pure, and only seem to separate the two further apart as man versus beast. This outlook familiarizes itself as the philosophy of the Galaxy team back in the Hisuian era regarding the vicious and unpredictable nature of wild Pokemon, predating Sinnoh and most likely even before Canon's myths were conceived. However, we are beginning to enter theory territory, so let's switch gears and focus on another interesting point that could be made against the leaked myths regarding serving as mere influences on actual canon. As I have stated before, the Canon library in Sinnoh houses many folktales that exist in official lore, despite their credibility still proving something to be desired due to their existence as ancient tales with the sole purpose of instigating thought and discussion. There is one myth in particular that seems to be inspired by the idea of a Pokehuman hybrid, that being Sinnoh folk story number 2, which reads the following. There lived a Pokemon in a forest. In the forest, the Pokemon shed its hide to sleep as a human. Awakened, the human dons the Pokemon hide to roam villages. This short excerpt harbors an interesting comparison to the Typhlosion story in particular, as the conclusion of that document also mentions a pelt that could cause its wearer to transform into a Pokemon should it be worn, just like how the figure of the folk story re-equips its shed shell. This direct correlation heavily implies that this folktale only came into existence through this leak, though it is important to note that this does not mean they are the same. Inspiration is often considered the catalyst for creation, and the creative process, at least in terms of writing, includes criticism and revision from both the writer and their peers. This of course is not to devalue the importance of a first draft as it serves as the building block for storytelling, but instead to refine it so that it could be much more digestible by a particular target audience. In the case of Pokemon primarily appealing to a younger audience, there are very evident reasons why this caliber of details could not be included and was scrapped to the cutting room floor, thus severing any connection between the two products. The power of ingenuity can also be applied to Typhlosion concept as a character design, bearing similar appearances to the yokai Mujina, a Japanese badger that is believed to inherit the power of shapeshifting to deceive humans. Given the contents of this archive, this should serve as more than enough inspiration on its own to birth such a story. To wrap up this argument, I want to briefly acknowledge a detail of this Gigaleak that I have witnessed people use against the idea of these leaks being non-canon. Another major revelation that has cropped up from these leaks is an expanded cut of the creation myth of Sinnoh, which features what I will refer to as Arceus' alignment chart, and the mention of giants within a brief passage of what I can only imagine is the first Pokemon battle. If these elements look and sound familiar to you, it's likely because they actually are featured in the Gen 4 titles, albeit loosely. Regardless, their presence in actual media raises the question of how plausible its canonicity is. to which I might agree that it is canon, or more specifically, could be. The main argument I pose against it comes from their lack of context within the games, as it is clear that they hold some weight, but we as the players just haven't been made fully or officially aware of it yet in-universe. I believe that this has led many to interpret this as Word of God lore, implying that the developers willingly shared this information when we must again remember that this was an accidental leak. Along with this, the usage of this myth as an exception to bolster the other story's credibility doesn't entirely line up, as our slack exposure to the creation myth's components immediately trumps that of what we have experienced with the PokeHuman tales, the closest thing only being Sinnoh Story number 2, and even then it isn't much more than an arguable comparison. At the time of writing this script, we have only made it through roughly 100 gigabytes of this 1 terabyte of information, and there are no signs of this wave of forbidden knowledge coming to an end anytime soon. As cursed as some of this information may continue to be, however, it is imperative to remember that this stuff was not meant to be released to the public eye for a perfectly valid reason, and should not be taken at face value until further notice. I hope that this video was able to convince some of you to change the way you interpret these stories, or provides you with points to be made against those who argue otherwise, but do be mindful to be respectful to one another and Game Freak themselves, as their employees surely do not deserve to have their privacy leaked like this, no matter which way you slice it. Thank you all for your time.